Alright guys, that's a Subaru shop, but we're here in a Nissan, because that's how that works. Alright, so what are we doing here at the Subaru shop down in Tiverton, Rhode Island? Well, there's a huge debate online, which has been proven time and time again, but nobody seems to want to listen. Which intake is better, cold air, short ram, or stock? So I've got my resident scientist here and resident Juke owner, Angela, who's donated her car to this to really bring in. Angela here has donated her car to this little task. She has a cold air intake on her car, InGen brand. So here's what we're going to do today. We are going to test a cold air intake versus a short ram intake versus an OEM intake. Now, to eliminate as many variables as we can, we have taken air filters out of the equation. No air filter, we're looking at intake design itself. We're looking for gains. Does each intake give any gains in any certain part of the RPM band over another? We're going to do 3 pulls with each. We'll take an average for peak horsepower, an average for peak torque, and then look at the highest graph that we get out of those. We're going to compare all 3 of them together later on and look at our results. Now, this is a turbocharged car, so I don't think it's going to actually do anything. Angela, what do you think is going to happen?
I don't know. We'll see.
Jay, what do you think is going to happen?
I think the stock airbox is going to win.
Stock airbox, he says. All right, so some background in Angela's car. I couldn't find a stock Juke, so we have hers. So her car has a fast religion front mount intercooler on it. It has a InGen hard pipe, and it has a InGen cold air intake on it. That's all that there is for horsepower mods. It has an exhaust, but that doesn't really matter because she got a factory downpipe. But anyway, so the intake's the only thing we're changing. We're leaving the intercooler alone. We're leaving the hard pipes alone. Again, no air filters. We're trying to do this with as little variables as possible. We're going to time the poles separation between the poles so we make sure we do them all exactly the same. That way we can get nice, even data. So let's see what happens. Cold air intake poles. First pull was 147, 143. We'll look at the graphs afterward. Cold air intake pull number 2. So second pull, 153.5, 155.2. Cold air intake pull 3. Cold air intake test number 3, 157.7, 153.4. We'll look at all the graphs afterward. So mind you, we've been letting this car sit for 5 minutes between each pull with air in the intercooler. We're going to do the same thing with the next ones. Alright, so we are putting the short ram intake on now. We're just going to toss it in there. It's not getting bolted up. We just need it hooked up to the car. So this is short ram intake pull number 1. intake test number 1, peak 153.3, 153.6 torque. Short ram intake pull number 2. Short ram test number 2, peak 154 horsepower, 151.3 torque. Again, we're going to look at the graphs all together afterward. Short ram intake pull number 3. Alright, short ram pull number 3, 155.6 horsepower, 150.7 torque. So we're putting the stock airbox back in with no air filter, because that's how we've been running these tests, is no air filter. So Jay, I know there's a Nissan in your shop, but there's no need to be so violent. Pull number 1 with the factory intake. Alright, factory and airbox 152.8, 148 flat. First pull. Stock airbox pull number 2. Alright, factory airbox pull number 2 is 152.5 and 150.5. OEM airbox pull number 3. Alright, OEM airbox pull number 3, 152.5 wheel horsepower, 150.8 wheel horsepower. That's about the same numbers we had for all 3 styles, Angela.
His swing was with the cold air, 10 horsepower swing.
Yep. So the cold air went from 147 to 157 on the same intake.
But then you get to the short ram and it's
Short ram was more consistent.
2 horsepower
yeah,
swing.
143 to 1.
The stock airbox, exact same thing every time.
OEM airbox is exactly the same across the board.
Yeah.
So Jay, what should we take away from this?
Gotta put the bigger turbo in.
Yeah, we gotta put the bigger turbo in.
So, gonna go over all the graphs, but basically, the OEM intake is more consistent, and the cold air intake doesn't make any more power, but it's got a wider range of what it does. So you either losing power or you're making a tiny bit more. 2 horsepower is negligible. So anything under 10 you really won't even notice. Anything under 10 I personally consider dyno or transmission noise, especially on these CVTs. But I'll show you guys the graphs so you guys can see all of that, so we can actually do a matching of where gains are and where they are not. Alright guys, so we're back at the garage and it's time to look at dyno graphs. I've got a bunch of data that we need to go through. I'm going to put these graphs up on the screen so you can see them while talking about them. Now when we did this testing, we made sure that we did a few things to maintain consistency. In between each pull, we timed it to be 5 minutes between each pull on each intake. When I installed the intakes, we made sure we still sat that 5 minutes. We removed the air filters so that the cold air intake could be in and out really quickly. We eliminated air filters from the equation completely, so that has nothing to do with these test results. This is strictly on changing the intake itself and nothing to do with the filter material or the filter style itself, which really doesn't make a difference anyway. So here is the data set, and here's all the information that we gathered from this testing. Okay, so we're gonna look at consistency, because as we all know, consistency is the most important thing. What's the point of making an extra 20 horsepower if you're losing 20 horsepower the next time you do a pull? So we're gonna start with the graph for the OEM intake. As you can see, all of these lines are basically identical. There's no one line that goes over the other, so all three pulls on our OEM intake were exactly the same, which is the result that we were expecting. The car's tune is specific for the OEM intake, so obviously it's going to be the most consistent. So next up for consistency, we're going to talk about the short ram intake. So if you look at this graph, you can see kind of in the mid-range between about 3,500 and 4,900 RPM. The torque kind of goes up and down between the three pulls. It's not exactly as consistent as the OEM intake, but it's not really that bad. Some of that might be contributed to CVT noise, but it's definitely not as consistent as that OEM intake. Now we're going to take a look at the cold air intake, the Mac Daddy of them all, alright? You can see right off the bat that something is definitely going on here. This cold air intake made drastically different horsepower numbers between pull 1 and pull 3. Two of the pulls were about the same. One of the pulls, the first one, was really, really low for some reason. As you can see, the consistency is just not there in the graph. So it's definitely got a weird kind of weird way that it's affecting the ECU. And if you look towards the top end, so anything above 5,300 RPM, you'll notice that the peak horsepower is all over the place. All three of those pulls have completely different torque. All three of those pulls have completely different horsepower. They're just all over the place. It's the least consistent intake that we saw as far as the way the graphs go. All right, so graphs aside, we looked at the actual graph data so you can see what the graphs are doing. Now we're gonna look at actual peak horsepower numbers because the claims that come along with these intakes is extra horsepower. We've seen claims of people saying that 15 extra horsepower, 5 extra horsepower, whatever it is. So we're gonna start off with our OEM. The best pull out of the three, which they were all really within like 1 horsepower of each other, was 152.8 at 5550 RPM, which that's about where we expected it to be. That's where these all-wheel drive cars typically sit. So from there, we go to the next similar intake, which would be the short ram intake. Now the short ram intake did 155.6 at 5722 RPM. So you're talking about a less than 4 horsepower increase. Anything like that, it's negligible. You won't even feel it. Really, it could just be a change in any number of variables on the dyno. Anything under 10 horsepower, I don't consider anything to write home about. He doesn't consider anything to write home about. It's not an actual result. So like if you have a car that makes 499 horsepower and you want that 500, it's 1 horsepower. So from there, we're gonna look at the cold air intake. Now the cold air intake, we mentioned before, consistency, it wasn't there. Over all 3 pulls, we had drastically different numbers. Now, the cold air intake, the highest pull it did was 157.7 horsepower. That was at 5,700 RPM. Now, just so you know, if you look back at that graph, which is now back up on the screen, it only made that extra 5 horsepower in like a 300 horsepower, 300 RPM range, and then it dropped back off. So really, it's not even through the entire rev range that it makes extra power. At the same time, if you look at the lowest number that made, it only made 147.8 horsepower, which is 5 horsepower less than what the factory intake made, which if you put your averages in here, it does exactly the same peak horsepower as the OEM intake, give or take half a horsepower or something like that. So really, it didn't make much of a difference at all. So now let's look at all 3 of these layered over each other. This is the best pull from all 3 intakes layered on top of each other is the graph you're now looking at. As you can see, from 2,900 RPM all the way to 5,200 RPM, they're basically the same. There is no one that stands out better than the rest. And then the cold air intake does make a few more, and I literally mean a few more extra horsepower from like 5,400 to 5,600 RPM. And it's like a bump, which is probably just the CVT gearing. It's not actually any engine horsepower increase. So, I mean, this right here is about as good as you want for data. We could have spent all day on this dyno and we would have probably gotten the exact same results, which is changing the intake on your turbocharged car, specifically the M116 DDT, does not actually give you any extra horsepower. If you want extra horsepower, you will need to get a tune. Bolt-on parts don't affect these cars. The ECUs automatically calibrate down the horsepower. It sees weird math readings, but it checks the air-fuel ratios and it puts it back into check. Unfortunately, the air-fuel ratio system on the dyno was acting kind of weird, so it was kind of like dropping off randomly throughout the poles. But the graphs that you just looked at, if you look at where the air-fuel ratio is reading, all of them were exactly the same. The car was doing nothing to gain horsepower. So what does this information give us? So this information tells me that if your first modification of your car is going to be an intake, probably shouldn't do it. If you want extra noise, we showed you a free modification to make your intake a little louder in the short ram installation video. Highly recommend doing that. If you just want the cool piping that goes into your fender, just remember, no matter how many hydro shields you put on the end of that thing, water still gets inside of that filter. The past 3 Jukes that have come up here during rainstorms with cold air intakes with hydro shields, and I pulled the air filter off and showed them, hey, you still got water in here. That's not good. So realistically, if you're doing a full build, you're gonna do bolt-ons, you're gonna be doing a tune, I highly recommend a short ram intake. Short ram intakes are safe. You're not gonna have any difference in horsepower or capability of making horsepower with a short ram intake. As a matter of fact, the 330 horsepower Jukes that we have built both have short ram intakes. So if you can make that kind of horsepower with a short ram intake and not a cold air intake, that kind of got to show you something. But the data kind of speaks for itself. All 3 of these intakes with no tune, it doesn't make a difference. Now, if you were to tune on just an intake, so if you were to put a cold air and a short ram, probably wouldn't make any difference either. The thing that affects turbocharged cars the most when you're getting a tune is how efficient your intercooler is. The second that air hits that turbocharger, it heats up. It super heats up. So if your intercooler is not efficient enough, then I don't care how cold the air is going into the turbo, it's not going to make any sort of definable or seeable difference when it gets to that throttle body. So there's all the data. Do with it what you want. Put your own opinions down below if you want. But yeah, so that's all the information. Do what you want with it. You got my professional knowledge on the subject. So as always, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you check out our other build videos, and have a great day. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. Make sure you go check out the new website we have up, thefastreligion.com. You can get all kinds of merch, decals, and you can also read more about the builds we're doing. In the meantime, why don't you check out these other cool videos that we have going on, and make sure you hit that subscribe button.